The hogs were feeding when Samuel found the finger. Blood pooled beneath trampled hooves, while massive bodies churned the pen into crimson slurry, their snorts echoing across the pre-dawn silence of Blackwood Plantation. What started as another brutal night of bondage had become something far more sinister, a calculated act of revenge that would shake the foundations of antebellum Mississippi. This is the story of how one enslaved man named Josiah turned his master's own livestock into instruments of justice, erasing a monster from the earth, one bone at a time. The year 1837 found Mississippi drowning in cotton profits and human misery in equal measure. Blackwood Plantation sprawled across 4,000 acres of delta soil, where the humidity hung thick as molasses and the screams of the whipped carried farther than church bells. Master Edmund Blackwood ruled his domain with a leather whip and iron fist, his cruelty legendary even among men who bought and sold human flesh for profit. Before we descend deeper into this blood-soaked chapter of American history, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this one fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in courthouse records for over a century. Josiah had endured 12 years under Blackwood's boot. Purchased at auction in Natchez at age 16, he'd grown from boy to man in fields that stretched beyond the horizon, his back crisscrossed with scars that told the story of every perceived slight, every moment of defiance, every second of hesitation when the master called. But Thursday, September 14, 1837, would be different. That was the night Josiah's patience finally shattered like glass against stone. The evening had started like countless others. Blackwood, drunk on whiskey and power, had dragged Josiah from the quarters for sport. The master's entertainment often involved finding new ways to break spirits, and Josiah's refusal to fully submit had made him a favorite target. But this time, something in Josiah's eyes had shifted. Where submission once lived, rage now burned steady as forge fire. The whipping lasted until Blackwood's arm grew tired. 47 lashes by Samuel's count, each one splitting flesh that had barely healed from the previous beating. Blood ran down Josiah's legs, pooling in the dust, while other enslaved people watched from doorways, forced to witness their own potential fate. They stood silent, complicit in their terror, watching a man be flayed alive while calculating their own survival. What would you have done, standing in those doorways? Would courage have moved your feet, or would fear have kept you frozen like the others? As Blackwood stumbled back to the big house, leaving Josiah tied to the whipping post until morning, something fundamental shifted in the night air. The quarters fell into uneasy silence, but beneath that quiet, a different kind of storm was brewing. Because when men are pushed beyond their breaking point, they don't always break. Sometimes they bite back. Rope burns cut deeper than whip marks when a man decides to live. Josiah hung against the wooden post through the long Mississippi night, feeling blood dry sticky on his back, while planning Edmund Blackwood's death with the methodical precision of a man who had nothing left to lose. The master's snores drifted from the big house windows, each rumbling breath marking time until justice would finally be served. What transforms a broken man into an executioner isn't rage alone. It's the cold mathematics of survival meeting opportunity in darkness. The quarters had fallen silent by midnight, but Josiah knew others lay awake behind thin cabin walls. Ruth, the cook who'd smuggled him cornbread after beatings. Samuel, the field hand who'd counted every lash. Old Moses, who'd watched 20 years of brutality with eyes that remembered Africa. They understood what was building in the night air, the way animals sense storms before the first thunder rolls. At 2:30 in the morning, Josiah began working the ropes. Blackwood had been drunk during the binding, his knots sloppy with whiskey confidence. The hemp fibers gave way strand by strand, each small victory paid for with flesh scraped raw against the post. Blood made the work slippery, but it also made it possible. The plantation held its breath. From Samuel's later testimony, recorded in the Adams County Courthouse. That night felt different, like the air before lightning strikes. We all knew something was coming, but nobody spoke it out loud. By 3:15, Josiah stood free in the pale moonlight, his torn shirt hanging in bloody tatters. The whipping post cast shadows that looked like gallows, while Spanish moss swayed overhead like hanged men dancing. But vengeance required tools, and tools meant the barn where Blackwood kept implements for both farming and punishment. The barn doors groaned open on rusted hinges. Inside, scythes hung beside whips, axes next to shackles, the instruments of plantation life, arranged with casual brutality. Josiah's hands found the hatchet first, its wooden handle worn smooth by years of chopping kindling. The blade caught moonlight like a prayer made steel. He tested the edge against his thumb, sharp enough to split bone. But killing Blackwood would be simple compared to what came after. Bodies had ways of speaking even after death, telling stories through wounds and blood patterns that could hang every enslaved person on the plantation. The Hogs, though, the Hogs were different. They left no evidence, no questions, no traces, except scattered bones that looked like accidents. Edmund Blackwood had bragged about those pigs at dinner parties, how they'd eat anything thrown into their pen, scraps, slop, even the occasional runaway who died from exposure. The master thought his livestock made him powerful, but tonight they would make him disappear. What kind of man feeds another human being to animals? The same kind who whips children for sport and sells mothers away from their babies. The same kind who builds wealth on broken backs and calls it civilization. The big house loomed ahead, its white columns gleaming pale as cemetery marble in the pre-dawn darkness. Floorboards creaked like confessions under Josiah's bare feet as he climbed the servants' stairs to Edmund Blackwood's chamber. The big house smelled of tobacco smoke and decay, its wallpaper peeling like diseased skin, while portraits of dead ancestors watched from gilded frames. Behind the master's door came the rhythmic snoring of a man who'd never lost a night's sleep over the lives he destroyed. Tonight would be Blackwood's last peaceful dream, though he'd never wake to realize it. The bedroom door stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of expensive furniture and silk curtains that cost more than most enslaved people would earn in lifetimes they'd never own. Blackwood lay sprawled across his four-poster bed, one arm dangling toward an empty whiskey bottle, mouth open in drunken vulnerability. The same mouth that had ordered countless beatings now produced nothing but helpless snores. Josiah stepped inside, hatchet gripped tight enough to leave impressions in the wooden handle. Moonlight streaming through tall windows illuminated the scene like a stage set for judgment. The powerful man reduced to meat and bone, the powerless one holding the instrument of transformation. Power had always been temporary. Tonight it would change hands permanently. The killing took seconds. Blackwood's eyes opened once, wide with confusion and terror, before the blade silenced them forever. Blood, soaked into expensive linens, spreading dark stains across fabric that had been woven by hands just like Josiah's, somewhere across the ocean. The master's body convulsed briefly, then went still as autumn leaves. Death looks different than revenge fantasies promise, but the real work was just beginning. A corpse in the master bedroom would bring investigations, questions, hangings. The Hogs offered a different solution, complete erasure, as if Edmund Blackwood had simply vanished from the earth like morning mist. Josiah began the grisly process of dismemberment, using the same methodical precision he'd learned in slaughtering plantation livestock. The body came apart in pieces that could be carried discreetly through darkness. Arms first, then legs, the torso last. Each component wrapped in bedsheets that would soon feed the flames of the kitchen fire. Blood pooled on hardwood floors that had witnessed dinner parties where guests discussed the inferiority of African minds while their food was prepared by African hands. By 4:30 in the morning, Josiah was hauling the first load toward the hog pen. The animals sensed his approach, massive bodies stirring in their enclosure with the anticipation of feeding time. These same pigs had grown fat on plantation scraps for years, their meat destined for the master's table, in a cycle that would end tonight with perfect, terrible symmetry. He threw the first piece over the fence. The hogs fell upon it with savage efficiency, their squeals echoing across the sleeping plantation like prayers answered in darkness. Within minutes, bone cracked between powerful jaws, while hooves trampled evidence into mud that would tell no stories come morning. What transforms livestock into accomplices? Hunger recognizes no moral boundaries when meat appears in darkness. 3 more trips brought the remainder of Edmund Blackwood to his final resting place, the bellies of beasts he'd proudly shown to visitors. Steam rose from the hog pen like incense from hell's altar as dawn broke over Blackwood Plantation on September 15, 1837. Samuel approached the feeding area with the usual bucket of slop, expecting another routine morning of slopping hogs and mucking stalls. Instead, he found scattered fragments of expensive nightclothes tangled in the mud and something that made his stomach lurch, a gold signet ring still attached to what remained of a human finger. The discovery would unravel everything, but not in the way anyone expected. Samuel stood frozen at the pen's edge, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were telling him. The hogs snorted contentedly, their snouts still dark with dried blood, while bone fragments littered the churned earth like broken pottery. A torn piece of silk pajama fabric fluttered from the fence post, expensive fabric that only one man on the plantation could afford. The field hand's first instinct was to run, to drop the bucket, and sprint back to the quarters, pretending he'd seen nothing. But running would bring questions, and questions would bring rope. Instead, Samuel did something that would haunt him for decades. He began cleaning up the evidence from the Natchez Courier, September 18, 1837. Local planter Edmund Blackwood reported missing from his estate. Extensive search underway. Foul play suspected. Samuel gathered bone fragments with shaking hands, tossing them into the adjacent woods where they'd look like animal remains. The ring presented a bigger problem. Blackwood had worn it constantly, and its absence would be noticed. But the hogs had done their work too well. The finger was barely recognizable, making the ring appear to have simply fallen off during some mundane activity. By 7 in the morning, the pen looked normal again. The hogs had returned to their usual lazy wallowing, their bellies full and their consciences clear. Samuel walked back toward the quarters, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd witnessed. Josiah sat on his cabin steps, his back wrapped in clean bandages, nodding to Samuel, with eyes that spoke volumes without saying a word. The conspiracy of silence began immediately. Ruth emerged from her kitchen, took one look at both men, and understood without explanation. Old Moses appeared from the fields, his weathered face creased with something that might have been satisfaction. Word spread through the quarters faster than cholera, carried on glances and gestures rather than whispers. The big house remained quiet until mid-morning, when Blackwood's absence from breakfast raised the first alarm. His wife Margaret had died 3 years prior, leaving him with only house servants to notice his routines. The cook knocked on his bedroom door at 9:15, receiving no answer. By 10 o'clock, the door was forced open to reveal empty rooms and rumpled bedding, but no master. What happens when evil simply vanishes? The world continues turning, but something fundamental shifts in the balance. The search began immediately. Overseers combed the plantation grounds while neighbors were summoned to help. Dogs were brought in to track scents that led nowhere meaningful. Blackwood's trail seemed to end at his own bedroom door. The enslaved population was questioned individually, each person maintaining perfect ignorance while secretly celebrating their liberation. But secrets have weight, and 47 people carrying the same secret created pressure that would eventually demand release. Sheriff William Dawson arrived at Blackwood Plantation on horseback at 11:45 that morning, his badge catching sunlight like a promise of justice that would never come. The lawman's boots stirred dust clouds as he dismounted, surveying the pristine grounds where evil had simply evaporated without leaving proper evidence behind. His investigation would prove as thorough as it was futile, because some crimes erase themselves more completely than others. When 47 witnesses share the same lie, truth becomes whatever they decide it should be. Dawson interviewed the house staff first, beginning with Ruth in her spotless kitchen. The cook maintained perfect composure while describing Blackwood's normal evening routine: dinner at 7, whiskey until 10, then retirement to his chambers. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, just another night that had somehow consumed her master entirely. "He seemed troubled lately," Ruth offered, her voice carrying just enough concern to sound genuine. "Talked about debts, about selling some of us off. Said he might take a trip to New Orleans to settle affairs." The lie slid from her tongue smooth as butter, seasoned with details that would send investigators chasing shadows in the wrong direction. Samuel's testimony proved equally unhelpful. The field hand described finding Blackwood's bedroom door open that morning, the bed unmade but empty. No signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of violence, just absence where presence should have been, like a magic trick performed by invisible hands. The sheriff examined the bedroom with increasing frustration. Expensive belongings remained untouched, ruling out robbery. The window was too high for escape without assistance. The bed showed signs of recent occupancy, but revealed no secrets about where its sleeper had gone. Dawson's investigation was drowning in normalcy. By afternoon, search parties had combed every acre of the plantation. Dogs followed scent trails that led to dead ends. Neighbors volunteered their own enslaved people to help with the search, creating an army of searchers who knew exactly where not to look. The hog pen received cursory attention, just another part of the barnyard where livestock went about their normal business. Blood feeds more than soil. That evening, as Dawson prepared to expand his search beyond plantation boundaries, Josiah made his first public appearance since the whipping. He emerged from his cabin moving carefully, his wounds still fresh, but his demeanor calm. When questioned about Blackwood's disappearance, he expressed appropriate concern while maintaining perfect ignorance. "Master was angry after he whipped me," Josiah said, his voice steady despite the pain that showed in his eyes. "Said something about teaching lessons, about showing who was really in charge. Maybe his anger took him somewhere dangerous." Another carefully crafted lie that suggested Blackwood's own rage had led to his downfall. The sheriff noticed Josiah's condition: the bandages, the careful movements, the obvious recent trauma. But a beaten slave was hardly unusual on a Mississippi plantation. If anything, Josiah's injuries seemed to eliminate him as a suspect. How could a man barely able to walk have overpowered his healthy master? What Dawson couldn't see was the steel behind Josiah's eyes, the satisfaction that came from watching justice disguised as mystery. Evil had been erased so completely that even its absence looked innocent. The investigation would continue for weeks, but its failure was already guaranteed by forces the sheriff couldn't comprehend. Whispers traveled faster than wildfire through the slave quarters. That October carried on autumn winds that stripped leaves from trees like secrets falling to earth. Each cabin held fragments of the truth: a blood-stained shirt hidden beneath floorboards, a hatchet cleaned too thoroughly, the shared knowledge that Edmund Blackwood would never raise his whip again. But knowledge shared among the powerless becomes invisible to those who refuse to see it. 47 people had witnessed justice disguised as disappearance, and their silence formed an unbreakable chain. The investigation had stalled completely by the third week. Sheriff Dawson had questioned every soul on the plantation multiple times, searched every building, dragged the nearby creek, and found nothing but frustration. His reports grew increasingly desperate, as pressure mounted from neighboring planters who demanded answers. If Blackwood could simply vanish, what prevented the same fate from befalling them? Old Moses had begun telling stories in the evenings, gathering children around the fire to speak of African kings who turned their enemies into feast for wild beasts. The tales seemed like harmless folklore to any white person who might overhear, but every enslaved adult understood their deeper meaning. Justice sometimes wore the face of lions, sometimes the snouts of swine. Ruth noticed changes in the plantation's rhythm. Work continued as always. Cotton still needed picking. Fields still required tending. But the fear that had seasoned every task for 12 years had lifted like morning fog. People moved with straighter backs, spoke with less caution, laughed without checking over their shoulders first. From the personal diary of Margaret Thornton, neighboring plantation owner, the Blackwood Negroes seem almost cheerful lately, most peculiar, given their master's disappearance. One would expect them to be distraught. The overseer, a cruel man named Patterson, had assumed temporary control of daily operations, but his authority felt hollow without Blackwood's backing, and the enslaved population sensed this weakness like predators scenting wounded prey. Orders were followed with deliberate slowness. Tools went missing and reappeared in wrong locations. Small acts of resistance multiplied like seeds taking root in fertile ground. Josiah had healed enough to return to fieldwork, his back still bearing fresh scars, but his spirit transformed. Other workers watched him with new respect, not fear, but recognition. Here was a man who had looked death in the face and emerged victorious, who had proven that the impossible was merely the untried. But secrets create pressure, and pressure seeks release through the weakest vessels. Young Timothy, barely 14 and new to the plantation, had overheard fragments of adult conversations. The boy's understanding remained incomplete, but his loose tongue posed danger to everyone who'd participated in the conspiracy of silence. What happens when a child holds adult secrets? Sometimes wisdom comes too late to prevent disaster. The breaking point arrived on October 23rd, when Timothy was questioned again by Sheriff Dawson. The boy, nervous and eager to please, mentioned hearing something about the master going to feed the hogs, a phrase he'd misunderstood from overheard whispers, but one that made the sheriff's blood run cold with sudden realization. Sheriff Dawson's boots struck the hog pen fence like hammer blows against an anvil, as Timothy's words echoed in his mind. The master going to feed the hogs. The boy's innocent slip had cracked open a grand possibility too horrific to ignore, sending the lawman's investigation careening toward a truth that would shake Adams County to its foundations. Steam still rose from the mud where massive bodies wallowed, but now that vapor looked less like morning mist and more like evidence dissolving into autumn air. When children speak truth without understanding it, adults must face consequences they thought they'd buried. Dawson ordered the pen drained and searched, despite protests from Patterson that disturbing the livestock would cost money and time. Workers were forced to drive the hogs into adjacent enclosures, while investigators sifted through months of accumulated mud, slop, and waste. The sheriff's hands shook as he examined each fragment of bone, each suspicious object that emerged from the muck. The first discovery came within an hour, a piece of fabric too fine for pig bedding, too expensive for slave clothing, silk pajama material that matched descriptions of what Blackwood typically wore to bed. Then came the gold cufflink, tarnished but recognizable, engraved with initials that spelled out Edmund Blackwood's identity in elegant script. Josiah watched from the field, his hands never pausing in their cotton-picking rhythm while his eyes tracked every movement around the pen. Other enslaved people maintained their work as well, but tension crackled through the autumn air like electricity before storms. The carefully constructed illusion of Blackwood's mysterious disappearance was crumbling with each piece of evidence pulled from the mud. By noon, enough fragments had been recovered to paint an unmistakable picture. Blackwood hadn't vanished. He'd been fed to his own livestock, piece by piece, his body erased by the very animals he'd proudly displayed to visitors. The sheriff's face had gone pale as Mississippi cotton as the full scope of the crime became clear. The Hogs had done their work too well, but knowing what happened was different from proving who had done it. Dawson began interrogating the enslaved population with renewed intensity, focusing on anyone with recent injuries or grudges against the master. Josiah's name rose to the top of the list immediately, the recently whipped field hand who'd had both motive and opportunity for revenge. When confronted directly, Josiah maintained his innocence with the same steady voice he'd used throughout the investigation. "I was hurt too bad to move that night," he insisted, showing bandages that still covered healing wounds. "Ask anyone. I could barely stand, let alone overpower Master Blackwood." The alibi seemed solid until Ruth cracked under pressure. After hours of questioning, the cook finally admitted she'd helped tend Josiah's wounds that night, cleaning them and applying fresh bandages. But her story contained a crucial gap, several hours between midnight and dawn, when she couldn't account for Josiah's whereabouts. What breaks first under interrogation? 1837 Mississippi. The answer depended on who was asking the questions. The investigation had found its prime suspect, but proving guilt would require more than fragments of expensive clothing and gaps in alibis. Iron shackles bit into Josiah's wrists like the teeth of hungry metal as Sheriff Dawson led him from the quarters toward the county jail in Natchez. The October morning carried the scent of burning leaves and impending rain, while behind them, the plantation watched in silence. 46 pairs of eyes bearing witness to the price of resistance in 1837 Mississippi. The man who had fed his master to hogs now faced a justice system that would grind his bones just as thoroughly, though with less efficiency and far more ceremony. When the powerless strike back against power, the system's response is always swift, brutal, and public. The trial began November 6th in the Adams County Courthouse, a white-columned monument to Southern justice that had never seen a black defendant walk free. Judge Harrison Whitfield presided with the cold authority of a man who owned 30 slaves himself and understood exactly what message needed sending. The courtroom packed with plantation owners and overseers, all eager to witness justice restored to its proper order. Josiah's defense was handled by a young lawyer named Thomas Meridian, appointed by the court and paid in Confederate script that barely covered his expenses. Meridian argued self-defense, pointing to Josiah's brutal whipping and the years of documented abuse that preceded the killing. But his words fell on ears that heard only the threat such precedent might create. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Samuel Crawford, painted a different picture entirely. They described a calculated murderer who had used the cover of darkness and his own injuries to commit the perfect crime. The dismemberment showed planning, they argued. The use of hogs displayed cunning. This was no crime of passion, but premeditated revenge that threatened the very foundation of civilized society. Witness testimony revealed the community's fractured loyalty. Ruth took the stand with tears streaming down her face, forced to describe tending Josiah's wounds while carefully omitting the hours she couldn't account for. Samuel testified about finding the bone fragments, his voice barely above a whisper, as he described cleaning up evidence he'd never been ordered to touch. From the Natchez Daily Courier, November 11, 1837. The Negro Josiah showed no remorse during testimony about his master's gruesome fate. His cold demeanor chilled spectators who observed a complete absence of Christian repentance. The jury deliberated for exactly 23 minutes before returning their verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. Judge Whitfield sentenced Josiah to hang by the neck until dead, the execution scheduled for December 1st, to serve as an example during the cotton harvest season when rebellious thoughts might otherwise take root. But Josiah's face showed neither fear nor regret as the sentence was pronounced. He looked across the courtroom at the plantation owners who had gathered to watch justice performed, and something in his expression suggested this wasn't ending the way they hoped. What happens when a condemned man still believes his cause was just? Sometimes death becomes victory, disguised as punishment. The hanging was scheduled for dawn on the courthouse square, where every enslaved person in Adams County would be forced to watch power reassert itself through rope and gravity. Even today, locals claim that on foggy October mornings, the ghost of Edmund Blackwood can be seen wandering the ruins of his plantation, searching for body parts the Hogs never finished. Rope stretched taut as piano wire in the December dawn, while 300 souls gathered in Natchez Courthouse Square to witness power restore itself through calculated violence. Josiah stood on the gallows platform with his hands bound behind him, looking out over a sea of faces that included every enslaved person within 50 miles, forced witnesses to what happened when the natural order was challenged. The morning air tasted of frost and fear, but the condemned man's eyes held something that made plantation owners shift uncomfortably in their fine coats. This execution was meant to end rebellion, but some seeds take root in the strangest soil. Sheriff Dawson read the charges and sentence with official solemnity while the crowd maintained enforced silence. Josiah was offered final words, a tradition that assumed condemned men would beg forgiveness or warn others against following their path. Instead, he lifted his voice to carry across the square with startling clarity. "I killed a man who bought and sold human beings like livestock," he said, his words cutting through winter air like blade through flesh. "I fed him to his own hogs because that's what he deserved. If that makes me a murderer in your law, then your law is the real crime here." The crowd stirred uneasily. This wasn't the repentant speech they'd expected from a doomed slave. Plantation owners exchanged worried glances, while their human property absorbed words that would echo in quarters and fields for generations to come. Judge Whitfield signaled the executioner, eager to silence this defiant voice before it spread more dangerous ideas. The trapdoor opened with mechanical precision, and Josiah dropped into history with his neck snapping clean as a wishbone. His body swayed in the morning wind while the crowd was ordered to observe for a full hour, enough time for the lesson to soak into every watching mind. But lessons have ways of teaching themselves differently than intended. The enslaved witnesses saw not a cautionary tale about the price of rebellion, but proof that even the most powerful master could be brought low. They watched Josiah's still form and understood that fear was a choice, not a permanent condition. From the personal diary of Reverend James Hartwell, the execution achieved its intended effect of restoring order, though I detect a troubling undercurrent among the Negro population. They seem to regard the condemned man as some manner of folk hero rather than criminal. The plantation system continued unchanged after Josiah's death. Cotton still needed picking, fields still required tending, and the machinery of bondage ground forward with relentless efficiency. But something had shifted beneath the surface, a recognition that power was more fragile than it appeared, that even hogs could serve justice when justice served no one else. Blackwood Plantation was sold at auction 3 weeks later. The new owner, Colonel Marcus Fairfield, instituted stricter rules and harsher punishments, understanding that Josiah's example needed countering with overwhelming force. But force has limits, and some ideas prove bulletproof once they take root in determined minds. The hog pen was filled in and converted to a vegetable garden. Workers claimed the soil there grew the richest crops on the plantation, though none would explain why they avoided eating anything that came from that particular plot of earth. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Hit, comment, subscribe before it drops.